This is my 44th video on my work with OO gauge. See part 1 of this series for my reasons for getting into OO gauge when I already had a lot invested in working in N gauge and I didn't really have space available for a large, fully operational OO gauge layout. Also see my lengthy series on my N gauge railway modelling for smaller and more complex scenery and smaller scale trains running. This part is the 18th dealing with my third layout made using mainly Hornby EZ Track. See the prior video, part 27, for my reasons for wanting to try a Hornby EZ Track layout when I already had an OO gauge layout using Bachmann EZ Track. This part covers my build of the Superquick Railway Hotel, B33. This was another fairly complex build, so I'm afraid this will be a slightly long video. This is the kit as it comes. Even though this is a large building, the kit is far less heavy and substantial than Metcalfe kits for much smaller buildings. Superquick kits are of an older design and don't use heavy card strengtheners, laser cut parts, or any similar components. However, they do manage to make quite solid buildings by the use of tabs and bracing pieces, etc. And the quality of the actual texture printing in the Superquick kits is excellent. So far as I can see, they're a cut above other card kits available other than Metcalfe. They're definitely a bit trickier to build than Metcalfe kits, but they can create some nice buildings for a layout if you take your time with them. Here's what you get when you take this kit out of the package. One folded sheet of printed card parts, 2 sheets of printed paper parts, a typical Superquick set of glazing parts all crammed close together on a small sheet, one 2-sided sheet of instructions, and a warranty card. The printed card parts are formed, as is usual for Superquick, from a printed sheet of white paper backed with brown card. The white paper is actually larger than the brown card, so it sticks out all round the edges, with the result that some parts will have tabs that end in paper without any card backing. The downside of this way of forming the parts is that it is quite prone to warping. The kits get around this largely by straightening the parts out with folded tabs, bracing pieces, or suitable gluing to other parts. Nevertheless, there does tend to be a bit of a battle with warping from time to time when assembling Superquick kits. Here are the 2 sheets of paper parts and the glazing parts. Some of the choices for the paper parts are a bit odd. It's normal, at least for Superquick, that paper would be used for ridge tiles and gutters, and using paper for signs and curtains pretty much makes sense. But using paper for the background cover, well, it seems that they did that just because they didn't have room for this large part on the card sheet and they didn't want to go beyond the one folded card sheet. The glazing parts are also, as is usual with Superquick, crammed together with extremely small borders. Superquick kits are generally made as if paper and acetate were terribly expensive items of which it would be a sin to waste a single millimetre. Perhaps they were extreme conservationists before their time. The instructions for this kit have more illustrations than is usual with Superquick, but they're still highly verbal and in English only, so you'd better be able to read English well if you're planning on building one of these kits. The instructions are in black and white, printed on 2 sides of a single sheet. The 2 sides of the folded sheet of printed card parts are labelled Sheet 1 and Sheet 2, and since it appeared that no parts bridged across the fold, I actually cut along the fold to separate Sheet 1 from Sheet 2. The extreme conservationism continues to these printed card parts, which are printed with parts often touching each other and sometimes with one part embedded in another. It can sometimes be quite difficult to tell where one part ends and another begins, so trying to cut the parts out from the sheet is a bit of an adventure. And you do have to cut them. They are pre-cut, but quite a bit of your own cutting work is going to be needed to separate the parts neatly from the sheet. This is the first part to be worked on the front and left walls of the main building, as it comes separated from Sheet 1. This is the back of that part. Note that it is edged with paper with no card backing, but those edges will all function as part of tabs. The upper and lower front walls are separated at the left of the part. That is intended, as the upper wall will be recessed. Superquick seem to like having walls with either the upper or the lower part protruding. They also like fancy roofs with multiple slopes. I guess those features make their buildings less boxy and more interesting looking. The blanks for the windows need to be removed. This also requires some careful cutting. The instructions say to pop them out, but I wouldn't try it. If you push them out without cutting, you'll get nasty, ragged, torn bits. The glazing parts on the glazing sheet are all carefully numbered. However, Superquick didn't print any numbers on the instruction sheet to indicate which glazing parts were supposed to be used for these main walls. They did for all the other walls. There are numbers on the instruction sheet for these walls now, but I penciled those in after I spent 20 minutes trying to figure out which glazing parts should be used for the various windows in these walls. And I'm not kidding, it was especially tricky trying to figure out which parts should be used to glaze the windows with the curved tops on the left wall. I basically did it pretty much by process of elimination, looking what windows were going to be used for the other walls and then seeing what I had left over and comparing them to the windows in this wall. With this Superquick kit, they do something a little different for the windows. They supply paper parts to go behind the glazing on all of the windows. These parts represent curtains with just a black area between the curtains, and some of them also have an effect to simulate frosted glass, or perhaps it's meant to be net curtains. Once I figured out which glazing pieces to use, I cut them from the glazing sheet with scissors, and then I cut the matching curtain backing pieces from the paper, and those are numbered to match the glazing parts. The Superquick instructions say to stick the glazing parts on with transparent tape, but I never do that, as I would be afraid they'd fall off inside the building over time. I glue the glazing parts in place, doing my best to work with the limited borders available on the Superquick parts. Then the paper parts just glue on behind the transparent parts. All of these parts need to be glued in place whilst looking through the windows from the outside, as obviously it's the outer appearance that's important and you want to have everything lined up properly. This is the effect on this wall from the outside. Annoyingly, I've damaged the left wall slightly by touching it with a finger with glue on it. You can see here where I've penciled in the numbers for the glazing parts on that wall. Those numbers are correct, trust me, so you can use them if you build this kit. At right, you can see the next stage in the assembly, using folded tabs and glued-in brackets to form the walls. I gathered the various bracket parts from where they were hidden on the sheets amongst the other parts. The tab at the end of the left wall folds round and glues to the back, helps to keep the wall straight. The bottom tab is folded and held at a right angle using bracing pieces. The tab at the top of the front wall folds down and its end is glued to the left wall. The instructions say to do this first. I held one of the wall supports in place whilst gluing the end to make sure that I glued the end with the tab at a right angle. Then additional bracing tabs are glued into the corner between the walls to hold them firmly at a right angle. And yet another tab is glued at the bottom. I glued tab C to the bottom tabs as well as to the walls. I'm not sure if this was intended, but it seemed a good idea to strengthen things. Then finally, odd-shaped bracing pieces are glued in place to hold the upper and lower sections of the front wall in place, keeping both sections vertical with the upper section properly stepped back from the lower section. Here's that assembly from the outside at this point, starting to look a bit like a building. This is the other part for the walls of the main building, making the back and right walls. Here it has already had all of its tabs separated and its window blanks and embedded parts taken out. In this case, the instructions clearly indicated which parts should be used for the windows. The general assembly of this section is similar to that of the front and left walls, except that there is no stepping between the upper and lower wall sections here. Here I have located and cut out the window parts and backing parts for these walls. The edge tabs fold around and glue back. This strengthens the walls and helps to take the warp out of them. The tabs at the top fold out toward the front of the wall. Those are intended as guides for the roof of the side extension. The glazing parts are glued to the back of the wall, lined up by looking through the windows from the outside. Then the paper curtain parts are glued on behind. The instructions said to use tab C for bracing the corner of these walls, but there was only one tab C and we already used it for the front and left walls, so I used tab E, which didn't seem to be spoken for anywhere else in the instructions. Of course, it's just serving to brace the walls at a right angle, so you could really use any suitable piece of card. Again, the top of the back wall tab folds down and glues to the side wall at the end, but you need to make sure that the tab is actually bent at the proper angle when you glue it. Then another tab goes at the bottom to hold the angle of the walls, and supporting pieces are glued to the tabs at the top and bottom and to the wall itself, holding the tabs in place and strengthening and straightening the wall. The instructions say to glue the front and left paving in place at this point, so I found those parts and cut them out from the sheet. If you're going to build this kit, I would suggest that you not attach the paving at this point. Leave attaching the paving until after the front and back wall assemblies have been attached to each other. I followed the instructions and attached the paving at this point, and it caused me significant problems with the later assembly. I attached the front paving along the length of the front wall, where it seems to fit exactly, with the piece at right going round the corner and butting up against the end of the wall. Then the left paving piece goes along the bottom of the left wall and butts up against the front paving. Attaching these paving pieces is tricky, as there's not much for them to be glued to. They have to be attached by their edges to the groove where the tab at the bottom of the wall is folded. I do this kind of gluing on a piece of scrap foam board to avoid getting glue on my cutting mat. I actually put this side paving piece on backwards the first time, then I realised that it had little drains printed on it, and those were supposed to go at the bottom of the downpipes, so I took it off before the glue dried and put it back on the right way round. The instructions don't mention little details like this. In fact, they tend to be rather cavalier, often just telling you to fit things without giving you any suggestions as to how, so you need to watch out yourself for these little details. Once the paving is in place, a piece for the main front porch step is folded in two and glued across the main entrance. Then another doorstep piece, also folded in two, glues on top of that. I had considerable trouble finding the porch surround mentioned here in the instructions. I had this piece, which had been labelled Porch Surround on sheet 1. You'll see it in the middle of sheet 1 if you go back and look at sheet 1 near the start of this video. But this certainly didn't look as though it was what was meant in the instructions here by Porch Surround. Finally, I found the intended parts sitting around a door in a piece that had been taken out from the back wall parts. Having found the darn thing, I glued it in place around the entrance. I had to deal with another problem at this point. One of the two tabs that folded back in the doorway, the right-hand one as seen here, had come completely cut from the wall. I didn't cut it, it came cut right through on the sheet. I taped over the cut as I normally do when something is separated and it shouldn't be, but taping wasn't going to be good enough in this case, as that join needed to be folded at a right angle and was going to be very visible on the finished building. So I had to do my best to try to repair the join with glue. The main front door then glues onto the back of those two folded tabs. You can see the tape with which I originally reattached the tab here at the left of the doorway. Here's the front door in place after my best efforts at fixing things. Note the effect on the window parts for the ground floor. I assume that the lower part there is supposed to represent frosted glass or possibly net curtains. Now we come to why I said the paving shouldn't have been attached earlier. I attached the paving along the front wall, and then the end piece of the paving went around the right end of the wall, butting up against the end of the front wall and against the end of its folded back bottom tab. But when you come to attach the back wall assembly to the front wall assembly, you find that the right side wall is supposed to come up behind the end of the front wall and glue to the back of it. Well, it can't do that if the paving is in the way. And no, it can't possibly sit on top of the paving. That would put the step in it for the upper front wall at the wrong level. That right wall has to butt up against the end of the front wall at ground level, and its step has to go under the upper part of the front wall. So I had to cut out a bit of the paving and a bit of the front wall bottom tab in order to make a groove for the right wall to fit into, as you can see sort of at the centre of this picture. None of this is mentioned in any way in the instructions, except that they do say to attach the edges of the side walls to the ends of the front and back walls. Even if attaching the paving had been left until after this assembly, which would have been better, you might still have needed to shave the bottom tab of the front wall a bit to get the side wall to fit properly. Once I'd cut that groove for it, I glued the edge of the side wall to the bottom section of the front wall. You can see how the upper section of the front wall only just fits on top of the step in the side wall. Then I glued the upper front wall to the edge of the upper section of the side wall. Even with my groove, the side wall seems maybe a bit too far out. Perhaps I should have cut a bit more off the tab and a bit less off the paving. But the whole thing would have been a lot more straightforward without the paving there at all, and the paving and associated parts could perfectly easily have been done after attaching together the wall sections. The other corner, where the left wall attaches to the back wall, goes together similarly, with the edge of the side wall gluing to the inside of the back wall. Here there is no step in the wall to worry about. That corner went together reasonably well, though I should still perhaps have shaved a bit off the end of the bottom tab on the back wall. With the walls of the main building together, attention turns to the extensions, of which there are two that attach, one to the back wall and one to the side wall, to the right side wall. This is the part for the walls of the side extension. Its right-hand bottom tab fell right off as it came completely cut through on the sheet. Superquick seem to have had some problems forming their score lines without going right through on this kit, since several things sort of fell apart when they weren't supposed to. Since all of those bottom tabs just fold round and glue back, I didn't bother with tape in the case of this detached tab. I just glued it in place on the back where it was supposed to go after folding round. I removed all of the blanks from the window and door holes, discarding the waste pieces but saving the tab G that came out of one of the holes. The instructions clearly indicated which numbered glazing pieces should be used for these walls, and I cut them out. Here you can see the instructions for the two extensions with the numbers of their window pieces marked and their various brackets and braces indicated. Here are the side extension walls with their windows glazed, and the appropriate paper curtain parts are cut out and attached behind the windows. Then the side door is glued into the door opening. Now the walls are folded round and braced at right angles with tabs. Here's that extension from the outside at this point. Next, the back extension is assembled basically similarly. The bottom tabs are folded up and glued back. The window and door parts are located and cut out and attached in their respective openings. The former for the rear extension is incorrectly labelled right extension wall former. That has to be the former for these walls, as there is nothing else remotely the right shape. So those walls are folded round and braced. And here's the back extension from the outside. I've glued on the barge boards at the top of the back wall. The instructions said to do that at this point. Normally I leave attaching barge boards until after the roof is on, but in this case I went with the instructions and attached them to the wall first. This does have the advantage of providing a thicker edge to which to attach the roof, so long as you line up the barge boards exactly with the edges of the walls. These are the parts for the roof of the side extensions, rather a scary assembly with multiple folds. I started the folds each in its correct direction. I also coloured all of the edges of the roof with a brown marker, as I figured this would be easier to do now than after the roof was assembled. The roof is assembled into its odd double peak shape with the help of two forming pieces, rather fiddly to do. This is the main roof. It folds up in the middle at the dotted score line and down at the other two score lines, giving a double-ridged shape. Dormer windows need to be made to fit into the main roof. There are 4 of these, and the parts for them are hidden in various places on the 2 sheets. 2 of them came out from holes in the back and right walls. The dormer windows need to be glazed, and this is extremely tricky as there is very little room to work with. The top corners of the glazing pieces need to be cut off to make them fit, and this is sort of indicated by the printing on the parts. You can see there's little lines at the corner there. The top corners also need to be cut off from the curtain pieces. I found that even with the top corners cut off, the glazing pieces still ended up sticking out from the bottom edges of the card parts, so I shaved off those protruding edges of the glazing pieces with a sharp knife. I just about managed to get the dormers assembled looking okay. The instructions then just say to fit these into the main roof, with no guidance as to how. I rather felt this was a bit like saying walk on water until you reach your destination. I basically went with focusing on getting the bottom edges under the dormer windows glued to the bottoms of the openings in the main roof, and then tilting the dormers forward until their sides hit the top of the opening in the roof, and then gluing the sides in place by applying glue from the back. It didn't help that it wasn't easy whilst doing this to really determine exactly what the angle of the main roof would be. Then there were roof pieces for each of the dormers. These at least were easy to find. They were all in a row next to the main roof on the sheet. I coloured the edges of these before trying to fit them. The dormer roofs seemed to end up sticking out a long way from the front of the dormers, which made me think that perhaps the dormers were supposed to be tilted further forward, but I couldn't have tilted them further forward without either cutting some off the tops of their sides or making the holes in the roof bigger. The piece to go along the top of the step in the front wall was attached at this point, as per the instructions. This was quite tricky to do, as the front wall wasn't actually exactly straight. It bowed in a little in the middle. So if I attached the capping piece at each end, there tended to be a gap behind the capping piece in the middle. Fortunately, the bend in the wall wasn't great, and I was able to bend the capping piece a bit and get it to stay in place by gluing its back to the upper wall. W-shaped barge boards then glued to the tops of the end walls. At both ends, these need to be exactly aligned with the tops of the walls. Then the main roof is glued in place. I glued the 2 sides of the centre fold first, as I figured that this was the trickiest to get in place. Then I glued down the back piece, and finally the front piece with the dormer windows. I was relieved to find that the dormers didn't look too bad in place. They may not be exactly vertical, but the discrepancy isn't very obvious. The rear extension goes onto the back wall. I found in this case that the yellow tab that was supposed to guide the roof on was of no use whatsoever. I just glued the walls in place, centered as exactly as possible, and then glued the roof on, hooking under the edge of the main roof and with its back edges glued to the surface of the main roof. The side extension then glues on. In this case I sat the roof on the walls, not glued on at all, positioned the walls and glued them to the side wall, and then took the roof off and glued it in place. In this case, the guiding tabs in the wall for the roof were actually of some help in lining things up. That piece labelled Porch Surround comes back here. It turns out that it is the surround for the edge of the porch roof. The roof is made up with an oddly shaped tab folded back and glued, and then that surround piece glues around the edges of the roof tab. Now, columns for the porch need to be rolled from paper parts, seen here as they come on the sheet. Here are those paper column parts cut out. I had trouble finding something of a suitable size to roll the columns round. Something bigger than a skewer but smaller than a pencil was needed. I finally used this brass rod from a broken tool. The columns came out better than I expected after rolling round the brass rod. The larger size actually made them easier to roll than chimney pots, which is what this kind of rolling is generally done for. However, the columns as I rolled them came out a little too big to fit into the places for them in the corners of the porch roof, so I cut a bit from the tab in the porch roof to accommodate my larger columns. The columns then glue into the corners of the porch roof, and the porch roof is glued over the entrance with the columns resting on the step. There is a large paper part for the ground behind the building. Really, it would have been better if a card part could have been provided for this, as the paper is not going to be very rigid. That paper ground part is cut out. All of the paper parts have to be cut out completely with a knife. They're not pre-cut at all. There are doorsteps for the doors in the extensions. Both are labelled rear, but one is really for the side extension. The rear doorstep needs to be attached after the paper ground piece is in place. The side doorstep just sort of sticks out from the building with nothing under it. Paper parts are provided for the chimney stacks. The instructions actually said to attach these before, right after the main roof was attached, but I was more interested in getting the structure of the building completed, so I left the chimneys until the end. The chimney stack parts are scored and cut out. I made formers to go inside the chimney stacks from leftover pieces of Metcalfe heavy card, as I found the chimneys just too bendy when made only of paper. I glued the folded chimney stack parts round my improvised formers. I'm not sure if this really made things better. There are no holes in the roof for the chimneys, they just sort of glue to the side of the inner slope of the main roof. Also, no chimney pots are provided. There are just chimney caps with black circles to indicate holes. These are all of the ridge tiles cut from the sheet of paper parts. They need to be scored in the middle so that they can fold. The ridge tiles glue to the ridges of all the roofs. All of their edges and folds need to be coloured. It's fairly easy to colour the edges, but the folds are tricky, as even a fine marker will barely get in there. Perhaps a paintbrush would do better, but that wouldn't be easy either. Here the ridge tiles have been applied to the ridges of the main roof. These ridge tiles are unusual in being the same colour as the main roof tiles rather than a contrasting colour as is more normal. I actually rather like this effect. These are the small ridge tile parts for the dormer windows. And here are those in place. These are the ridge tile pieces for the roof of the side extension. I couldn't quite manage to imagine how these were supposed to be used. I think this is how they were supposed to go on. Well, this was what seemed to work best. So that's all of the ridge tiles in place. They certainly do improve the look at the roof. These are the parts for the gutters. Superquick paper gutters are always a pain in the rear, but I do apply them as they probably do make the buildings look better. No mention of these was actually made in the instructions for this kit, but the parts were included. The idea, as I know from other Superquick kits, is that the black part folds double, and then the tabs fold up and are supposed to glue under the edge of the roof. I messed up trying to fold the black parts double in this case. I tried to press the fold down with a metal ruler after applying the glue, and the glue bled and stuck to the whole part to the ruler. I lost much of one side, tearing the part off the ruler. So I glued another strip of paper over the part to replace what I'd accidentally torn off. These gutter parts always need to be pretty much entirely coloured with black marker in order to work. They'd look terrible if you left them with white edges and dotted fold lines showing. Here are the gutter pieces I ended up with after colouring and separating them all. The tabs need to be folded at a sharp angle from the black parts in order to go up under the edge of the roof. Here are the gutters for the front roof edges in place. It isn't easy to persuade them to glue under the edges of the roof. I sort of poke them up with the end of tweezers and try and hold them in place till they stick. Here are the back gutters in place, 5 more pieces of guttering. The last thing to go on the building was signs. Quite a variety of signs were provided with the kit. Since I'm modelling the 1930s, I didn't want car parks or AA stars, and I certainly didn't want a Trust House Forte sign. I stuck with simple signs identifying the Railway Hotel, although a couple of other names were provided should you prefer something different, and a beer sign that I rather like the look of. Here's the building completed with those signs in place. And finally here is the Railway Hotel on the layout. It proved to be about the same width as the template I'd made for it, but just a little bit less deep. Here's a straight front view of the hotel. And here's a general view of the central section of the layout with the hotel in place. I'm not even sure what I'm going to do next. There are still several buildings to be built, but it would also be nice to actually run some rolling stock a bit. We'll see.